So in today's cosplay tutorial video, we're going to be making the assassin outfit for Anya from Spy Family. For Anya's dress, I'm using Simplicity 6299 View A without the sleeves and adding a stand-up collar from a different pattern. Ideally, this would work best if you had a A-line dress with princess seams and a high neck, but I couldn't find a pattern that had all of those things, so I'm going to be Frankensteining some together. I made a quick mock-up of the bodice just to mostly test the collar, and it's too tight and too high, so that's going to have to change. I also took it in a bit at the shoulders so that it would fit me a bit better and there wouldn't be as much gapping at the armhole. Now the mock-up can be taken apart and the pieces used to change the original pattern. For Anya's dress, I'm going to be using a black matte satin for the outer part, and for the lining I'm using this peanut printed cotton that I got off of Etsy. I know that in the show her dress is lined with red to look like yours, however, I couldn't pass up the opportunity to line it in peanuts. I cut the dress pieces out, adding the modifications that I made, and I flatlined the cotton and the satin together so that it'll be treated as one piece of fabric. Take the center front dress piece, and we're going to do a rolled hem by folding it in twice and then sewing it into place. Sew the dress side front pieces to the dress front piece. Sew the dress side back pieces to the dress back pieces. Sew the dress front and back pieces together along the shoulder seams and along the side seams. Before I sew up the center back seam, I want to make these seam allowances a little less noticeable. So I'm going to be doing some sort of felling stitch on them. So I'm starting from the bottom of the dress, going up about 18 inches and snipping into the seam allowance, being sure not to snip through the stitches. Trim away the seam allowance on one of the sides up to the notch. Fold over the remaining seam allowance twice so that it completely encases the raw edge. Now, since my seam allowance was kind of small, it still shows a little bit of the serging, but it's better than before. Then I hand sewed it into place, trying to not have the stitches show through on the other side. They did a little bit, but it's not super noticeable, so I'm not going to worry too much about it. I cut the collar pieces out of black satin and on one of them applied fusible interfacing. Putting right sides together, sew the interfaced and non-interfaced collar pieces together along the top. Turn the collar right side out, press it flat, and then I went ahead and serged along the raw edges to help keep them from fraying. Sew the collar onto the dress. I also added a bit of top stitching to keep it in place. Sew the center back seam of the dress closed and insert a zipper. I then sewed down the center back seam just like I did the other seams in the skirt. On either side of the front panel, I snipped the seam allowance on the longer side, tucked it inward, and sewed a rolled hem. Then I finished the bottom edge of the skirt with a rolled hem. I tried on the dress and it seemed like there was a little bit too much fabric at the armholes, so I went ahead and trimmed away about 3/4 of an inch from them. To bind the edges of Anya's sleeves, I'm going to be using bias tape. Now you could use a pre-packaged bias tape, but I decided to make my own out of some of the same black satin that I used for the outer part of the dress. Putting right sides together, we're going to sew the bias tape around the armhole, and the piece of bias tape that goes down first is going to have a folded edge. That way, when it is folded over, it'll be nice and clean. Fold the bias tape over the armhole, tuck the raw edges inward, and then I hand sewed it into place. And with that, Anya's dress is done. For Anya's gloves, I made my own pattern by tracing around my hand, and then we're going to cut it out 4 times out of some black stretch fabric. Fold the edges at the finger and thumb over and hem them. Then, putting right sides together, we're going to sew the glove pieces together along the sides, leaving space for the thumb. Cut a rectangle for the cuff, fold it in half, and sew it together along the side. Putting right sides together, sew the cuff onto the bottom of the glove, and then we have a finished glove. I'm using a base headband that I got off of Amazon. It's just a cheap satin covered headband. And as you can see, it's not the right color, and you can either paint your headband, or what I'm doing is covering it in some gold fabric. And I just rolled it along the fabric and traced it around, not very well, but this is a disappearing ink pen, so the markings will disappear as time goes on, so I'm not super worried about it. And the fabric itself is cut on the bias, so it's got a little bit of stretch to it, which will hopefully help it curve around the headband better. I wrapped the fabric around the headband and sewed it into place using whip stitches, tucking the raw ends inward. I found it easier to sew it starting from the middle and working my way down, then going back and sewing it from the middle and working my way down. That helped keep it from moving around as much. For the spikes on Yours headdress, I've seen a lot of cosplayers use chopsticks since they're tapered at the end without being super sharp, so that's what I will be using for mine as well. I cut the chopsticks to the length I wanted them to be and then spray painted them gold. I used hot glue to attach the chopsticks to the headband. Then I also used some hand stitching just to further secure it, since I wasn't sure how good the glue was going to hold. I ordered these gold fake roses from Amazon since I couldn't find any gold roses in my local craft store. Popped the rose off the stem, and then since everything's glued together, it was pretty easy to peel this green leafy bit off of the end so that it is just the gold piece. I trimmed the stems off of the roses and hot glued them onto the headband. I also added some more stitches just to secure them since I wasn't confident that the hot glue would hold. And Anya's headdress is done. For the needle weapons, I'm using a 3D file from Dangerous Ladies that I printed out, and it's actually separated into 4 pieces. So there's a piece here, this handle piece, this little piece on the end, and then the needle itself. And there is a hole in the center so you can insert a dowel. However, for this piece, because I had to print it at an angle so that it would fit on my printer, there's a little bit of supports stuck in there. So hopefully I can still get enough of the dowel in it so that it will be secure and I can super glue everything together. The needles have been all glued together. I then sprayed them with a gray primer and added some filler, which is the reddish stuff, and sanded that down since it wasn't entirely smooth. I primed the needles one more time, sprayed them with gold spray paint, and then added a clear coat just for extra protection. And now that the Anya cosplay is finished, it's time for the reveal. For more cosplay tutorial videos, please subscribe, and thank you so much for watching!